People always ask me how long it takes to draw anything. I generally say anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. It's interesting, the simpler the cover, the more careful you have to be with every line, because every line matters. Breaking down the actual composition, the body gesture, the language, the quality of the line, how much energy it has, how thick the shadows are, things like that. As I'm doing this, I'm wondering whether it was such a great idea. Part of the, I think the power of art is that there's a mystery as to how it was created. You know, I don't know if this is incredibly interesting to people or supremely mundane and dull.
When I first think of Jim Lee, I just think passionate artists, because even if you don't necessarily agree with all his designs or his aesthetics, you can't dismiss that this guy really thinks what he wants, how he wants to present it, and has a reason for all his designs.
He's what you would call a rock star of comic book artists. There are certain people who come along and they just become the guy to be, the guy to imitate, the guy to emulate. Jim Lee, right from the start, was somebody to watch.
Welcome to Fat Man on Batman. I'm Kevin Smith. The dude we're sitting next to, or I'm sitting next to, you ain't anywhere from me, is one of those magic cats that in a time when nobody was talking about comics except the comic book community, he was pulling real numbers, man. We're going to talk to the legend that is Jim Lee. Welcome to Fat Man on Batman.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me.
I think when I broke into comics, my style really was, you know, like most people, is reflective of all the artists I loved growing up. So guys like Frank Miller, John Byrne, George Perez. I got into comic books in '86 because that's the year Dark Knight Returns came out, which Frank did. His work really opened my eyes to the potential of the medium. It showed me a story that was far more sophisticated and nuanced than anything I knew growing up. And then as I became a professional, I started noticing all these other artists like Mike Mignola, Barry Windsor Smith, and I started incorporating some of their work, and out of that emerged the roots of my style. But I will freely admit, when I first got into the business, probably for the first 5 years, the style was a guy trying to learn how to draw. That was the style.
And so even when I collected comics, I didn't actually collect them based on the storyline. If an artist only did 2/3 of a story and I didn't like the third artist on the finale, I wouldn't buy it. This was after I graduated from college and I'd moved back in with my family, and that's when I had this plan. I was going to get into comics, and I set up a drawing table right next to my bed in my bedroom, and it assumed like I already had the job, and I would wake up, roll out of bed in my boxers, sit down and start drawing stories. I would say every 3 months there was kind of a leap in terms of ability, and I credit that to continually keeping at it. And I do tell a lot of newbie guys that are trying to break in, like, you can't get any better if you only draw once a weekend every other month or when you feel like it.
Jim's coming from a family where there's a big work ethic, and his father is a doctor. He was going to go in that route. That was the expected route for him. He studied psychology, and then instead of going to medical school, he just found this renewed interest in art.
I think when you pick up your roots and you move away from your family to a country on the other side of the world where you don't speak the language and everything is kind of different and foreign, I think you go there for a specific purpose, and their purpose was find the American dream. Everything was geared towards that final goal. They indulged me in my interest in comic books because it was maybe a way to keep me quiet. It was a cheap form of entertainment. It was a way for me to learn English, just by reading the actual comic books. They saw that I had a love for the material. But I don't think in their minds at all ever harbored the idea that this is something I could do for a living.
I think the difficulty would be trying to make his parents understand that this might be an avenue worth pursuing.
That's really jarring and possibly alarming if you have someone who's going on this career path who's been rocketing forward without any stop in his momentum. And then suddenly, it's not, I want to go towards psychology instead of medicine. It's, I want to be an artist.
I think that was actually part of the problem. Once I did finally, years later, sort of express to them this idea of doing this for a business as a career, I don't think they could even comprehend the idea that someone could get paid to actually create these stories, because it's just something that was so foreign and different from their life experience.
And the fact that he said, I will give myself 1 year, I think immediately tells you what kind of person Jim is and what kind of person he's been raised to be.
I was 5 months into this year-long program, and so I sent in some work.
I got the addresses of all the different companies, and ironically, I only got responses from the big companies. I remember I got a form letter from DC, but Dick Giordano actually wrote a line like, interesting stuff, keep it up, and that was super motivating at the time.
It ultimately led to me going to a comic book convention in New York City. I met an editor named Archie Goodwin, who worked at Marvel at the time. He liked my samples, and that actually got my foot in the door, and I started working on Alpha Flight. I think when I broke into comics, my style really was, like most people, is reflective of all the artists I loved growing up. My style really is a pattern of habits that you accumulate over time that you find personally appealing.
In general, the mainstream comics of DC and Marvel, if you came onto a book, you were hired oftentimes partly because your style was similar to what was seen before.
The very first 3 or 4 years was all about absorption, looking at everyone's work, people's work I liked or didn't like, and really figuring out why I didn't like it, why I loved this guy's work, figuring out all the different ways you can draw ears, downshots, lighting schemes, all that. And once I kind of did enough research, quote unquote research, I put all that stuff aside and really utilized the knowledge I'd accumulated and focused on choosing what I thought looked best.
So, all right, you're doing you're at Marvel working on Punisher. So
Yeah,
that was
the
a book that broke you out?
It's into the kind of the consciousness of fandom. In that,
Because it was Wolverine?
Yeah, Wolverine and fighting the Punisher, and I penciled and inked it. I think it was one of the first issues I penciled and inked. And so Punisher War Journal 6 and 7 was when I first kind of felt like, oh, people knew who the artist was on this book. And the covers I did that kind of stood out, and kind of people started recognizing my style and my name, and that's kind of the start of it all.
I always say that, art sells comics before story. Mostly because you pick up a comic, you open up, the first thing you see is the art. The art's exciting, inviting, full of energy, it will pull you in. So when Jim steps on the stage with a number of the other creators that are emerging at that time, they really bring in a renewed sense of energy and a level of renaissance on the art sides of the comics. The dynamics of the characters, the dynamics of the action, they were being framed and positioned in ways we hadn't seen before. And I think overall, it just brought a new life to the books.
People were taking note of this. Suddenly you had these superstars like Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee. They were doing art in a very distinctive way.
Jim was drawing what superhero comics were supposed to look like. Neil Adams did that in the late 60s and early 70s. Jack Kirby did that in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It's like there's a guy who decides this is what comics about superheroes are supposed to be like. The first thing you see is just the draftsmanship. I mean, he can draw figures that look like figures. He draws figures in action that look the way a human figure would be in action, with that hyperbolic level of superhero juice added on top. And it's totally convincing and believable. There are a lot of artists who go over the top, and you just end up with figures that don't look remotely human or remotely possible. Instantly, he was like suddenly somebody who everybody up at Marvel was saying, whoa, look at this. We got to put him on our top book. You know, he became the X-Men artist working with Chris Claremont, and they put out, you know, some of the biggest selling comics of all time.
What appealed to me, the X-Men, is that they are characters that appear just like you or me until they hit puberty, and at that point they sort of gain these fantastical powers. They realize they're very different from everyone else, and they become outsiders to a society that they've vowed to protect. And so, as an immigrant coming to the United States, you do feel like you're an outsider, even though you can learn the language, you can learn the customs, you can learn how to dress and interact with other people. At your heart, you do realize you are different. There is something inherently different about yourself. So I always felt like I had the life and then the secret identity part to it.
It was an amazing time, the early 90s in comics, and I think people certainly refer to that as the speculator boom. There were a lot of people who were interested in collecting all those things. That was a great opportunity to get on the ground floor, X-Men #1.
Part of the success of X-Men #1 is that it had variant covers. And you had people who wanted all the covers because it created this giant poster with Jim Lee's art. They just loved his art so much, they were willing to buy the same issue again and again and again just to have this completed piece.
Well, I think his work brought a lot of new energy that we hadn't seen to a page. I think he really kind of took anatomy to the next level of what's acceptable in comics. And I think he also brought a whole different level of detail. It wasn't detail for detail's sake, it was detail to really enhance the look that he was going for.
Jim Lee wasn't just drawing X-Men anymore, he was seen as a creative force behind it.
A lot of fans will point out, like, I love the way you draw women, or I love the way you draw this character or that character, but very few of them point out this core essential element, I think, to a lot of successful artists, which is, how does the art make you feel? When I was a kid, it was really about what I saw on the page, which is like awesome anatomy, like really realistic looking faces and hands. And it wasn't until I got older and started understanding more of like, hey, what is the visual impact of what's being drawn? Looking past sort of the actual line work or the way a line is expressed on the page, and looking at the sort of visual vocabulary of what's been created.
He's really studied different comic styles that have proven to be very popular.
Jack Kirby would compose these incredible double-page spreads that had so much action, so much energy, and I still incorporate this today. You can create these amazingly complex images, but if all the elements of the piece, from the exploding debris to the hand that's coming forth to the people that are reacting to a character jumping forth, they're all organized in a way to draw your eye towards what's important. It's all about lighting, it's all about gesture, it's all about the size of relative characters to one another and how that makes you feel within the story.
I think Jim just did what came naturally. Those are the guys who really do rise to the top. They may have started with influences, but they have put their own spin on things pretty much from the start.
At the same time, no matter how popular you are, if you're writing X-Men, you're still playing with someone else's toys. And Jim and Todd and other people wanted more recognition, and they wanted to have more freedom in what they were doing. It makes sense that they left and created Image Comics.
Image was so many years ago, and I think a lot has been sort of written or said about why it was created, but I really think it was created just because we were a bunch of young guys that didn't know any better, and if someone says, do this, I think that the instinct, and it might be a biological one, is just to do this. It's just something that's almost hardwired into you.
Image was basically just a distribution company, a publisher, but it was not, all right, we own your characters, thank you. We were here for the creators, was kind of the idea. It's your book, we're putting it out in the world for you.
It's all about competition. I think a big part of the roots of Image Comics were a bunch of guys that really came up through the ranks together, were highly competitive against one another, and also very curious about what they could achieve on their own.
There's also a lot of making sure that your future is set and making sure that you take advantage of the moment. What is selling is Jim Lee's art, or Todd McFarlane's art, or any number of the Image artists' artwork and story and creativity. Why not have a more direct link to your end consumer?
Image was emerging when I was working in animation, and Wildcats had just broken as a show, and there was a heat around those books. People were more interested in learning about Wildcats than they were so many of the other characters that I had grown up reading.
There was no mission statement that was drafted. Like, none of us went to business school. We realized that we had a lot of things going on. Luckily, I met a guy named John Nee, who I hired, and he was really my right-hand man. He was really the guy that ran day-to-day operations in Wildstorm.
Jim hired me because I don't read comics, and when they were forming Image and Jim was spinning up Wildstorm, and we didn't even call it Wildstorm, it was Homage Studios at the time.
Each of us had our own individual businesses that operated independently underneath the Image sort of Uber publishing banner that we all kind of co-owned.
We were all really young. I mean, I came in, I was 24, but I came in as one of the older guys because Jeff Campbell was 18, Alex Garner was in his 20s, Brett Booth, everybody there was really, really young.
We all seem to come from sort of the same vantage point. We all enjoyed the same comics, the same movies, the same artists who came prior to us.
They had a great little setup in an apartment where they were all working together with their desks not more than 4 or 5 feet apart from each other, and they would finish up a panel and they'd pass it on. Jim would pencil it, he would pass it on to Scott Williams to ink, and it'd be done.
The production system was built for speed. That's why the writers and inkers and colorists and letterers are all located in the same place.
I was the first colorist that was brought in to Wildstorm. The colorist job has changed from what it used to be 20 years ago. When I started, it was when digital color was starting to get introduced. I was asked if I knew what Photoshop was, which I actually didn't. I had to teach myself Photoshop, and working along with John Nee, who knew everything there is to know about printing, we kind of both tried to figure out how we could get this program to work, to print correctly.
We developed a lot of technology or techniques on the fly to, if we wanted to finish a comic book and have it in stores in 3 or 4 days, and which was just this astounding production feat.
Everything we were doing, we were just kind of learning on the fly. We weren't, we didn't have a manual for it. We didn't have any technique that we could hire someone to teach us. It was really just like, okay, I know how to paint and I know how to use the computer. How can we marry these two?
It was a great opportunity to see all that happening at the time.
Jim's creations really were peaking in the mid-90s, and they were still going well, but I think in the end, he felt he's more of an artist, he's more of a creator than he is a businessman. And while he was fine at being a businessman, he really wanted to get back to being in the trenches.
Wildstorm then was merged with DC. Getting him to do one of DC's top characters, Batman, was a great, great thing for us.
Jim came in, they weren't sure what to do with him. He was Jim Lee. So while people were afraid to approach him, one of our editors, who was actually the art director of the company at the time, Mark Chiarello, reached out to Jim and Jeff Loeb, and he put the two of them together.
Hush kind of brought back this idea of Batman can be in an action blockbuster. And we hadn't been seeing that for a while. Batman, he would have adventures with the Justice League, but he was always skulking in the shadows during those adventures. In Hush, Jim Lee says, no, we're gonna see what he's doing.
Obviously, working on Batman to me was a creative challenge in that all these other amazing artists preceded the work I did, and you can literally trace it back to Bob Kane back in the late 30s. I think if you're going to jump into a project like Batman, you got to really bring your A game, and I'd never really worked on the character in a meaningful way before that. I think every comic book artist has at least one cool Batman story within them, and I think it's hard to say you've had a full career unless you've kind of worked on some of these iconic characters.
When we started with Batman, we really wanted it to be dark, and so we purposely went to much more of a solid black type of a rendition of some of the characters, whereas before maybe Wildcats we would have used a lot of line work. With Batman, a lot more solid blacks, a lot of change in the tools I would use. I would, instead of using a thinner pen, I would go with a brush in order to create sort of more organic type of a look. The difference between the way we work and the way a lot of people work in the business now is that I still get the physical board. I don't work off of his scans. I don't make blue lines.
We all live relatively close to each other. Scott's 2 blocks away. So there's still that, you know, when the deadline's on, we're driving back and forth to each other's houses. Hey, thank you. Here's your page back.
It's still very old school. It doesn't happen very often in the business anymore. It does create a sort of level of paranoia. I would be traveling with pages, whether I'd be going to a convention or going from the studio out to dinner or whatnot. I would take the work with me wherever I went. It would never get left in the car. It would never get left at the coat check. It would never get left anywhere. If there's any chance of anything going wrong, I would take the level of security to the point where I would take an attaché case with handcuffs and lock it to my wrist, because these are Jim Lee's pencils. You don't mess around with Jim Lee's pencils.
I think my role as a colorist, especially when it comes to an artist like Jim, it's harder with someone like Jim because the art is so precise. It's so good. I mean, let's face it, you'd buy the book if it was in black and white. I was searching for a way to make Gotham City feel different, to make it feel organic, like a character. And that summer, Lilo and Stitch had just come out, and they made these beautiful watercolor backgrounds. And after watching it, I actually went right back to the movie theater and watched it again. And it was then that I decided, I'm gonna paint these backgrounds on these pages. The first few pages I started to color, I was very tentative. I actually didn't like the work that much. And I showed it to Jim and Scott. And, what was cool about it was they pulled me into Scott's office. And they said, well, look, we want you to look at this guy's art, because this color stuff that we have here is what we like, what we want you to emulate. And they showed me books that I had colored. And that was it. I snapped out of it. And that was, to me, that was a huge challenge to live up to the hype of what the book was.
In Hush, Jim Lee says it's going to be fast and frenetic, and you're going to see it drawn across 2 pages. It's going to be this big motion picture action. You have Jeff Loeb going into Batman's minds, and you have Jim showing readouts in Batman's cowl of, you know, I will strike this person here because that's his weak point. It was a very different way of approaching Batman.
When it came time to publish, we said we could do a special format, special paper, you know, give you that Dark Knight Returns type of feel, you know, so it feels prestige, and just really upprice it and do all these crazy things. And Jim goes, no, don't want to do it.
I wanted to come back and work on a comic book that came out every single month and have readers really kind of, you know, at the edge of their seats after having read an issue going, where's the next one, where's the next one? Because that's definitely something I remember from my days as a reader, as a collector. From a fan perspective, they hadn't really seen my monthly work in quite a while. So, you know, to them, I might have been off the radar altogether.
That was a massive turning point for us, because by putting him on a regular book, it was saying that the regular line mattered more again.
It reminded you Batman's a superhero, and Jim Lee just threw that in our faces.
That's a credit to the story Jeff Loeb wrote. I think he knew his audience. He knew his artist. He knew what Jim Lee does best, and to not disappoint the fans by giving Jim, and thus the fans, something to really just sink their teeth into.
Jim on Batman basically said to me that every series that we thought had achieved its potential would only achieved a portion of its potential. The upside was much greater if you took the risk and put bigger name talent and more recognizable talent on the books. And you could see it roll. You see it start to build, and it started to build momentum. And all of a sudden, working on the series was the cool thing, the fun thing, the more exciting thing. And then the writers all felt that energy. They started working together, and you felt the cohesiveness of this universe. As he was winning over fans and bringing attention to DC, his level of success gave us cover to work from, so that we were able to build all the rest of the series we had, breaking big in the following years.
All-Star Batman and Robin, it was such a dream project for me. It was great. I mean, it was great working with Frank, and I think fans that have been able to pick up the first trade and kind of read that first initial arc of this overall story have really walked away enthusiastic about it, because it's so different from all these other Batman stories. People didn't really know what to expect initially because it was so different, but then once they got on board and realized Batman's putting Robin through these paces because he's trying to make a very specific point that at the end of the day, he's a miserable person without Robin, that he needs Robin essentially as his sidekick. It was very satisfying to work on something like that. Frank is obviously an artist as well as a writer, and he writes these very succinct scripts that immediately light up an image in your mind.
From an artistic standpoint, I really wanted to ratchet up the energy, because Frank Miller, when he writes stories, I really think that it's all about this sense of inertia and energy, and I really wanted to convey that in the inks. So whether or not a page would take me 10 hours or 1 hour, I really wanted it to seem urgent and immediate, so I would really make lines and renderings in a very immediate and quick fashion.
You're talking about Frank, someone who every moment that he writes or draws or paints is something very captivating. So you almost want to replicate that when you work for him. And in seeing his scripts and then seeing what Jim was trying to do, you could see that he was trying to, he's like, this is me trying to be Frank, or this is me working with Frank. And I think it kind of trickled down to us where we were, every moment was a big moment within every book. It was one of those great moments with a lot of kind of pressure on the side that you just have to live up to.
You look at Batman, All-Star Batman and Robin, you read Dark Knight Returns and Dark Knight Strikes Again, and they're all very different, and they feel different. There's a different kind of flavor to it. And to me, the difference was that he worked on Sin City between Dark Knight Returns and All-Star Batman and Robin, and you can see that influence, and you could see that the gritty aspects of the storytelling that he wanted to infuse into this kind of story, and it was great working with him.
Even through it all, creator, captain of industry, innovator, you remain a fan. And you've seen legends and worked with legends, yes, and drawn for the best and written your own stuff. But it's, I would imagine, nice when every once in a while, or more frequently in the new DC, you can get surprised by like where somebody's taking the story, where somebody's taking things.
It's a tough thing, I think, to do, and I kind of relied on being able to work with great writers. And so, working with guys like Jeff Johns or even Frank Miller, and then Scott Snyder, who's been a recent breakout, it keeps you fresh.
The initial impetus behind the New 52, it came out of a editorial retreat we had we realized that Superman wasn't doing as well. And that seemed odd to us because he was just as iconic, just as well known as these other characters, if not more so. Everyone loved the character, but there was something about the status quo, the premise at the time that didn't quite click or work. And so we started talking about the costume. We started talking about his marriage to Lois. If we had our druthers and could basically reinvent this character, what would we do? Maybe amend or update his costume. Maybe make the costume look a little more alien-like. I mean, he ultimately, he is Kryptonian. And I think that's when we all kind of said, you know what? What about doing this across the entire line? Like, why couldn't we take these principles that we just applied to Superman and look at the entire DC universe and see what that looks like?
I remember sitting down with folks like Marv Wolfman, Len Wein, Dick Giordano, and all of them explained to me one thing. They all had the one same story, that after Crisis on Infinite Earths, they should have restarted the line with #1. And for me, I always thought that would be a great idea to restart the line. Jim agreed.
We all kind of looked at each other and said, you know what? That's really bold. That's really exciting.
As a matter of fact, it would have been the Fab 48 and not the New 52 if it wasn't for Jim. I was very set on 48 titles, and Jim goes, 52, and I looked at him, why 52? And he goes, I don't know, you did that weekly series 52. Seems like a lucky number. And that's how the New 52 was born. We decided, okay, we'll go with 52.
All of DC would be foolish to not want Jim Lee drawing comics. Same as we would be silly not to want Jeff Johns to be writing comics.
Jeff and Jim are two passionate artists who are really about planning what kind of atmosphere are we building, what kind of character arc are we building. So it's great that their book was the first one out of the gate.
The goal for that book, for Justice League, was to lead by example. To take our top writer and our top artist side by side, put them together, and have them create a type of book that we could point to the other writers and say, this is the style, this is the voice, this is the tone that we're trying to establish throughout our universe. And it's a lot easier to explain yourself when you have a good example as that.
This is a clear reboot. You didn't just have, the comic starting differently. You had everyone's in a different costume, and there's just a different atmosphere throughout the whole place. Some characters have different races now.
We knew that it could, if pulled off correctly, it could be a huge boon for the industry. It could be a huge source of excitement and interest in comics.
Jim's true passion in the New 52, even more so than the character designs, was he was set on making it day and date digital. Set. Wasn't moving an inch on that one.
We brought the digital element in because we have a limitation with where our comic shops cover our readership. If you don't have a comic book shop near you, it becomes very hard to get your comics. We wanted to make sure that people had the opportunity to jump on this new wave of new #1s wherever they were.
So when we launched the New 52, part of the greatest concern that came from the retailers wasn't even about the #1s, but it was about the day and date digital, or people just going to gravitate and buy digital comics. And nothing could be further from the truth. Not only do we see triple-digit growth in our digital market, but we saw double-digit growth in our print market. They were working together, growing the business, reaching more people.
Superheroes make up so much of pop culture. I would love to see more kids at comic book conventions, more kids reading comic books, more kids reading, period. It was just startling to see the reaction from the market. I mean, I put it up there with the launch of Image Comics as being really memorable moments in my career, in that, you really see the excitement of what you're creating and how that really brings about this incredible emotional response from the readership, which is, like I said, your ultimate goal in creating this stuff. How do you define being an entrepreneur? I mean, is it about being creative in your work? Is it about being enthusiastic in your work? Is it about looking at existing systems, processes, business models, and trying to do something that's better? I think it's all three, and so to me, the two aren't mutually exclusive.
Jim Lee is the unusual comic book creator who is not only very talented on the page, but he is also very talented behind the scenes. And that's partly why he's parlayed his existence in the comic book business to the pinnacles.
It's the attitude, sky's the limit, and really pushing the boundaries, really taking a look at the art and saying, what can we do to make this better, more exciting?
How can we take some of the passion we have for these stories, these characters, and make this a more interesting hobby or more interesting art form? That's really been the mantra. That's been really the spirit that's kind of driven my day-to-day activities.